Командующий парадом капитан первого ранга Добрынин.
Russian naval successes, you don't need a very big book to write them all down in. Their economy is in desperation. All this idea of restructuring, again, I think is internal messaging to the Russian people. Whatever the dreadful West is saying, the fact that we've lost 1 million soldiers already is immaterial. We are going to restructure, rebuild to produce the greatest Red Army, the greatest Red Navy the world has ever seen. It's bonkers. It's rubbish. It just won't happen. The Russians love their parades, and we had the Victory Day parade in May this year, the showpiece in Red Square, where Putin invited his few allies along and looked at lots of soldiers and tanks going past. In a similar way, this is a naval equivalent, but it's much scaled back. I mean, because the Russian Navy is much scaled back. It's very much a propaganda tool to demonstrate that Putin is very much in charge. It is probably more of a propaganda tool internally, where people are starting to question Putin, to realize that actually his special military operation, 3-day military operation in Ukraine, is bleeding the country dry and the economy is sort of in free fall. So I think Putin is probably trying to demonstrate that actually he is still fully in control. Russian military is still a force to be reckoned with, and he's very much there to stay. I think it's just a chance for Putin to get out in the public. No doubt he will be very, very well protected. And whether it's him or one of his doppelgangers, one of his people who substitute for him, who knows? But yeah, it'll be a big day for the Russians. They like a parade, and it no doubt makes them feel better. Generally, we know that Russia has not been able to invest a heck of a lot in its maritime capability. All its efforts have gone to support its land forces in their fight of Ukraine, and predominantly keeping them filled up with ammunition and refurbishing tanks rather than building new warships. The Russians are putting out on videos that are pretty ancient. These are 30, 40 years old. There appears to be some form of air defense, but again, this is pretty ancient air defense type, which just puts large amounts of lead bullets in the air to knock things down. But we now know, with the growth in drones, although we're looking at drones very much as a land environment capability, we've seen from the Ukrainians that seaborne drones are equally important. But there's no reason why airborne drones can't attack ships. We're seeing swarms of drones, thousands, if not 10,000s. If put against some of these Russian naval ships, they'd be overwhelmed by some of their old air defense. So there are vulnerabilities to naval ships now that perhaps there weren't in the past. But with each threat, there was always mitigation. I was only talking yesterday about tanks fitted with lasers that can fire multiple targets. Britain announced last year it was developing a seaborne laser called Dragonfire that would be fitted to the ships that would make them much less vulnerable to attack from drones. So I think it would be premature to write off naval capability at the moment, because what it does mean is you can move a lot of hardware and personnel over great distances and fight from them pretty much self-contained. It would be a reasonable assumption to people to come to that Russia can keep building ships and tanks ad infinitum, but actually it can't. And $3 trillion they're talking about, they don't have $3 trillion. And only last week they were talking about having their banks having to be bailed out because there is so much debt in the country. And the debt is usually dealt with by the amount of money they get from oil. But with the oil price now down below $50 a barrel, it was thought to just maintain their payments on their debt, they need the oil price to be $60 a barrel or above. Now, we know that the Saudis and the Americans are trying to force the price down below $47 a barrel to $40 a barrel. I saw one ex-financial expert earlier on the week say that Russia would be bankrupt in 3 months if the oil price fell below $47 a barrel. So when it comes to all these great tries that they get spending trillions on their military, they just don't have it. Even Putin can't make ammunition and tanks out of thin air. And if Trump follows through with his 50-day threat to put tariffs and sanctions on oil, not only would the oil price be below that what Russia can survive, but the Indians in particular and the Chinese will stop buying their oil, and Russia will be in a perilous position. It seems that when it comes to naval power, the Ukrainians have been able to develop some really interesting bits of kit, not just the Neptune, but also their unmanned seaborne drones, as it were. Why the Neptune's been so effective? It's probably a combination of its ability to map the terrain, in other words, fly very, very low. It's very difficult for defensive radars to pick up anything moving towards it at very low level, because radars generally look in a sort of flat trajectory, if you like. But if you stay below that trajectory, it's been the weakness of radars really since they were developed in the Second World War. I expect there is allied to the Neptune's capability as a missile, there will no doubt be a lot of electronics going on as well to suppress any radar or detection systems that Russian naval ships might have. And as we have been discussing, it would appear that their technology is last generation, whereas what we're seeing in Ukraine is really the next generation. And also, it's all about operating procedures. That might be the reason the big Russian cruiser was destroyed in the Black Sea by a Neptune missile. Combination of really good bit of kit, smart electronics, and poor drills by the Russian sailors. China is building more ships, more military capability than anybody else, and is rapidly catching up. Certainly its technology is first class. We haven't really seen Chinese military in operations in the last few years to judge. There are a lot of components to military power. It's not only having good kit, but it's also having the right personnel, the right operating procedures, and also the will to do that job. But yeah, I think the Chinese are certainly not too worried about the Russians. They probably see the Russians are deflecting a lot of capability, certainly intelligence gathering capability, off themselves. But it's interesting that Pete Hesketh, the Secretary of Defense in the US, speaking only yesterday. This week is Special Forces Week in the US, and he's been supporting the US Special Forces. And in his speech to them, he was saying very, very clearly that the number one enemy of the US is the Chinese these days, and that is what military capability in the US needs to be benchmarked against. And the US needs to be able to prevail if it does come to conflict with the Chinese. So we're all focused on the Russians at the moment, what's happening in Europe. The US is very much focused on the Chinese, and China will be looking very much more closely towards the US than the Russians. But no doubt will cozy up to the Russians and pat them on the back when it suits them. We know that a lot of cruise missiles have been launched by Russian naval ships from the Black Sea and elsewhere. And also, when Russia was supporting operations in Syria, again, lots of cruise missiles were launched. So it's as in Western navies, that is one of their key roles. These cruise missiles can travel thousands of miles and are pretty precise. So I think that is probably the successes that the Russian Navy has had.